welcome everyone. And I'm so happy to be here with you. And yeah, kicking off this new season, um, it happens fast, doesn't it? So let's get started. And there's a number of topics that I'm going to touch on today. There's really insufficient time to go as deep as we probably would like to go on a lot of these, but we'll do what we can. And as always, this I view this as a conversation. I don't want to be talking at you, but I want you to be engaged with me. And again, if you have questions or comments, we try to fold those in. So, all right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so what we're trying to cover today, I'm going to talk a little bit about a winter retrospective, what's happened this winter, kind of where you are, where I am, and review a little bit of what we do over the winter as beekeepers and how HiveTracks should be a part of that or can be a part of that, let's say. And then we'll move quickly on to some spring topics that, depending on where you are, you're going to be in a different stage of this, but hopefully touch on something that will give you some insight or some new thoughts on your spring management. And then yeah, a few updates on where we are. Last talked to you in December through this format, and we've made a lot of progress since then. So happy to share where we are with that, and then get to any questions that you have at the end. So yeah, let's talk about the winter. Well, we started off at the January 2nd, I think, at the North American Honeybee Expo. And I don't know if any of you were there, but it's kind of the big kickoff event for us for this year. We also went to the North Carolina, South Carolina joint meeting a few weeks ago. And wintertime is always a time to kind of go to these bigger meetings. And so there's a map there. It shows where everybody was from. And again, hope some of you were there. And upcoming, we're going to be at the North Carolina meeting this summer. Then we're going to be at Apimondia. So any of our European friends, if you're going to be in Copenhagen in September, would love to see you there as well. So next slide. So what was winter like in your area? I'm sure we all have, thoughts and experiences about how winter was compared to what it usually is or what we expect it to be, things like that. Um, and it's important, obviously, for the health of your bees. I would say that the winter weather itself, we've got folks from Saskatchewan and Alberta, and that's a very different winter than, say, Georgia or Florida in the US. And the really cool thing about honeybees is they're very resilient. They do well in both places. They're very adaptive. But that weather is a stressor on our bees, right? So if they're weak for some other reason, yeah, it's a challenge to the health of the bees, and it shows up in losses, and that's why we typically in the past talk about winter losses, that sort of thing. So, just a quick question here: what was your? Put this in the chat if you know rate for the winter, or I had 3 out of 4 hives survive, or something like that. If you put it in the chat, just to get a sense of what your winter was like out there while you're doing that. And this is survival rate. I like on the positive side, not the loss rate. So how much survived. And where I was, for those of you following along, I mean, we lost a bunch of hives in the flood last year. I did have 2 that survived the flood. They were up closer to my house and didn't get washed away. And surprisingly, actually, both of those did survive. They're pretty small clusters, but they survived. The picture that you see in the image here, we had a pretty cold or and snowy winter, especially for January where we are. And again, for those that don't know, I'm in the mountains of North Carolina. If you look at a map of North Carolina, I'm right up in the northwest corner of the state. And this picture here is the creek that goes by the house was pretty much frozen over. So we had for single digit Fahrenheit, it is a little bit sub-zero Fahrenheit again. Um, and yeah, so it was pretty cold. But again, these two hives I had survived that. Um, and so that's how the flood survivors did. And I'll share a little bit later. We're ramping up more hives for this year. So looking in the chat, looks like y'all are doing pretty well. And someone had asked about to speak to the commercial losses. I have a note here that if you watch the socials or the media, it finally got out into the bigger media. I think that there were big losses reported from the commercial beekeepers when they're coming out of winter and getting ready to go into almonds. They're assessing their hives, culling dead outs, things like that. And there were kind of alarm bells going off. Then Blake Shook had some good updates on that. You probably saw some of those. And I think, at least from watching that, there's people are still trying to figure out, what happened, what was the cause for it. I don't think anything has been stated yet. They were able, at least with this event, to sample a lot of the bees, collect samples of bees and live bees, dead bees, wax, comb, things like that. And so they're in the process of labs and things or testing that to figure it out. I don't know how many of you were around for 2006, 2007. That was when the colony collapse disorder events happened, and I call them events because that was a kind of the previous big loss that caused alarm bells and everybody to kind of start freaking out in the commercial bee space about big losses. And it's actually in the history of HiveTracks. HiveTracks was kind of born out of the reaction to that. And my engagement with technology and bees was part of that original big losses that happened then. And people were comparing this loss to that. But again, there's no there's plenty of speculation and things like that people have. And as in most of these situations, I'd say wait and see what the real results are before we speculate too much. So, all right, next one. Okay, so in the winter, and again, we're out of winter. We're in springtime now. Although I'm sure in some places it still feels like winter. It was below freezing here this morning. We're in that time of year where it fluctuates wildly, right? We feel like summer one day and then winter the next. But before it gets into this crazy time and when we're set in winter, there are things that you can do as a beekeeper. Go out on warmish days, look at activity, and all these things you should record in the HiveTracks app. You can just create a record that says I visited the apiary. This is what I saw at the entrance, that sort of thing. What I would like to emphasize is the importance of recording your dead outs. So in events like we're talking about in the commercial losses, and even just across the United States, can we and other places as well, but in terms of assessing what's going on. If there's a widespread kind of issues, then having the data is important to figuring that out and understanding it. So it's important for you to record the dead outs for that greater purpose, but for your own good as well to kind of know what's going on. And the best thing to do is, if you have a dead out, take pictures of the frames, things like that. Determining the exact cause of death for a winter dead out is not an exact science at all, and it's quite elusive sometimes. But at least can be good observers and record the things that we see in the hive. And again, that'll give us some better information if we go back and are able to evaluate what was going on. So if you go to the next, I think what I have. Okay, so when you're looking at the entrance on a warmish day, hopefully you'll see pollen coming in when it begins to warm up. And this particular shot right here was from one of the hives at my house that survived the winter. This is my daughter's pet hive, I call it. It's painted and pretty and all that. And like a few days before this was covered in snow. And it's just amazing, always amazes me how quickly the bees and the environment just respond to this time of year in particular, the longer sunshine and just a little bit of warmth immediately turns the bees on and it turns the flowers on. And you can go from snow one day to they're bringing in pollen, 2 days later. And so again, those are the kinds of things you want to start recording. And you can just get those just by observing at the entrance to your hive. All right, Danny. So again, within the HiveTracks app, you can record a dead hive, and you want to, the first time that you note that that hive is dead, you want to record it to get as close as you can to the time that it actually died. That's part of the problem with winter dead outs. You don't know exactly when it happened. But again, we've got the tools in there to record that. You can see here, I've got a couple of records that I made for a couple of hives that died in other places that aren't at my farm. And again, record those, be diligent about doing that. All right, Danny. So this is a picture of a dead out. And actually, this is a fairly unusual case, at least in my experience. This one is one that starved. I'm pretty sure this was a starvation issue. And you can see there's a big pile of dead bees at the bottom. There's a cluster there. This was a hive that was located, it was actually it's one that I take care of on someone else's property. They were flooded. This hive didn't get hit, but you couldn't get to their house for a while. So I couldn't go and follow up on this hive. And they were just scarce of resources going into the winter. But again, this is one that pretty good idea of why it was a dead out. Was able to record it as well. Now the hive right next to it was great, doing well. So it was 1 out of 2 at this particular location. All right, Danny. Okay, so that's hopefully what you've been doing, or if you didn't record your dead outs, go back and record them. And again, get your records up to date and get ready for the season that is happening now. And so we moved from winter into spring. And one of the questions that folks have is, when do I do that first inspection of the season? Okay. Again, that depends on a lot of factors, which everything in beekeeping is pretty much it depends. And so it'll depend on the weather, depend on how strong the bees are, things like that. But you do want to, at some point, decide, okay, this is the time to start back up. Okay. And usually that first inspection, it may be a deep inspection, it might not. We'll talk about that in a minute, but we also want to review what are the areas that we're going to be looking at. Again, as we go through the season, we want to start off on, a good routine, a good habits of our inspection. And so again, within the HiveTracks app, we're looking at space, we're looking at the food, we're looking at the queen status, brood, and then all the other stressors. And just to remind us, that's the things that we need to look at, and they're all seasonally dependent. So this first inspection of the spring is going to be, you're going to want to look at those in light of this is coming out of winter. All right, Danny. So when do you do it? Well, you need a warmer day. It's best if you might have a string of warm days. And so you also want to look at what's blooming as well. So you can see in this picture, we have a red maple emmet bloom that's happening and a dandelion. And these are recent from where I am. And if I travel just a half an hour away from me, this happened 3 or 4 weeks ago. So I'm at elevation in the mountains, so I have this big difference between where I am and hives that are located off the mountain. The HiveTracks app has a weather, feed into it, and these are two images from yesterday that I just screenshots that I took. One of these is what we call up the mountain, and one's down the mountain, so you can see the difference in the weather. Like down the mountain might be okay to go into those hives. The ones up here, it's a little iffy. So again, make a judgment on is the weather good for me to go into the hives. Another source of information are your beekeeping buddies. Is anybody else going into their hives right now? If you're unsure, maybe talk to them as well. All right, next slide. Oh, timeout, aside, phenology. If you don't know what phenology is, go look it up. It's super important to you as a beekeeper. And this is an advertisement for one of my favorite sites, is this USA National Phenology Network. And it's a really cool map that shows the progression of spring for your area based on averages, historical averages. This is a little blurb I just cut and pasted from their site yesterday. Okay. And so as a beekeeper, being aware of what's blooming when is critical to making good decisions about your bees. Okay. And just knowing what they're working, what the available pollen sources, things like that are. Okay, next slide. So back to us. Well, we have a way for you to do this sort of thing. And if you have not tried the document flora record, it's your homework assignment is go out today, take a picture of something that's blooming and put a document flora record into the HiveTracks app. It's a really cool part of what we do. And it's part of you being a more holistic beekeeper, of not just knowing what's going on with your bees, but what's going on in the foraging radius of your hives. So go try that out. Next one. Okay, so back to the first inspections. We've already talked about when do you do it, what do you do? Well, you're just observing. You want to, one, confirm dead or alive. Hopefully, when you're going in, you'll see bees coming out the top. That's always a good sign. If you use inner covers, pop the inner cover off, see how many frames of bees you have. Again, that's a measure of the population. And getting that initial measure will let you know, are they growing the way they should as we come out of winter? Now, whether you go all the way to the picture on the right where you're pulling the frames out will depend a lot on the weather and really whether you need to go in that deep. If the weather is going to be okay and warmish, then going ahead and pulling those out is an okay thing to do. And then you're just making sure that you've got a queen in there and she's laying, and what are the food resources, right? Again, back to those core pieces of information that you're wanting to know. But at least get a good sense of this hive's alive, it's doing the things that it's supposed to be doing, and then you can come back soon and follow up on that. All right, next slide. So once you get past that first inspection, whether or not you can get into a good routine of, say, 10 to 14 days of coming back and looking at the hive will be very dependent on the weather. And that you will eventually get into a good routine, but the weather in the spring is wildly varying, right? So you might not be able to get on that schedule. And so you're going to have to really be on top of things. The bees, they'll, as soon as they can make progress. You know this about the bees; they're very aggressive in how they want to grow. And that queen will lay as long as she has resources and there's bees there and there's pollen. If they have the resources, they're going to grow. Now, what happens is as they're growing, maybe they run into a spell of rainy weather or a cold snap or something, they might have to contract. They might lose some of the brood, that sort of thing. But that's part of the spring growth. Okay. So your job in this is to stay ahead of that. Okay. Space is super critical this time of year. And that little bullet in the middle there, one full frame of capped brood will contribute 3 frames of covered frames of bees, which that is pretty amazing. And that stat comes from Randy Oliver's Scientific Beekeeping, or Ask ChatGPT. It tells you the same thing. Uh, and but so if you've got capped brood, then your hive population is going to explode pretty quickly if you've got any window of warm weather. So again, you need to stay on top of that. And like I said, the food at this point, as that population is growing quickly, the food is going to be critical. Normally, this is happening because resources are available, but pay attention because if you get into a situation where those resources are limited, then you might need to supplement. But in general, the natural nectar and pollen are going to be good. All right, next. Okay, so how do you manage this growth? By the way, if you have a healthy hive coming out of winter, your hive is going to grow and it's going to grow quickly, and you're going to need to do something with the growth because healthy bees make more bees, and you will have more bees than you know what to do with, and quickly you'll be losing swarms. I mean that's and maybe you're okay, maybe that's your management strategy, but if you don't do anything about the growth, you're going to have more bees than you know what to do with. So, how do you manage that growth? One way is splits. We're going to talk a little bit about that. You can allow them to swarm or try to control the swarming in other ways. There's cutting queen cells, things like that. We're not going to go into a lot of detail there. But again, the key point here is if you have healthy bees coming out of winter, they're going to grow and you're going to have swarming issues if you don't do anything about space and things like that. So, all right. Let's talk a bit about splitting. Okay, a splitting, it to me is really just controlled swarming. You are using the bee's natural behavior, their natural progression. When you have a healthy hive in the spring, it's going to want to duplicate itself. That's really what it's doing when it swarms. It's like a cell splitting and creating 2 cells. It's creating another instance of itself. And so we're going to talk for a short period here. We could do a whole webinar or 2 or 3 on splitting and all the techniques, but I'm just going to highlight a few things here about splitting and let you run off and do more do more studying on it. So yeah, let's talk about splitting. The key, if you don't take anything else away from this section, it's the key for splitting is resources. Resources in the parent colonies, resources in the splits, and resources, I mean food and queen and space. Okay, so all those kind of key elements for a healthy hive, you have to provide. All right. And then also within HiveTracks, whenever you create these splits, create a new hive, right? In the app, easy to create a new hive. You'll say the source of that split is from this hive. You can give details about the queens, that sort of thing. All right. As I said, this is what splitting is. In this image, this is from a few years ago. This is my son's sideliner operation. You can see there's lots of bees around, mostly double deeps that we're pulling splits out of and making nucleus colonies for him to sell. But this is, you're removing bees and resources from a parent colony to create a new colony. That's what it is. And it again mimics a little bit of the swarm process. One of the key components of or questions that you have to answer when you're doing a split is where's the new queen coming from? Okay. And that can be various places. It can be, you can use queen cells, like in the image here. This was a queen cell that was used to requeen or to queen the nuke. You could use a virgin queen. You could use a laying queen that you purchase, or you could do a walkaway split and they make their own. This little table here, again, it's from Randy Oliver, scientificbeekeeping.com. You can go find it there. Um, Depending on your source of the queen is going to determine how quickly that new colony gets up and going. And again, that depends on your objective as a beekeeper. If you're a hobbyist or whatever, and you're not, on a timeline or something like that, or wanting to try to get honey production this year, then walk-away split is a fine thing to do. It'll just take a long time for that to get going. All right, next. The mechanics of splitting, and I'll skip to the last point first, is again, there are a lot of videos and a lot of instruction and different ways of doing splitting. So again, go look at your favorite person on YouTube to get that, or talk to your buddy. But the thing I would encourage you to do is just to try it. You'll learn a whole lot by splitting a hive. And the principles of it are the same. You have a parent colony. The parent colony should be a good, healthy colony with lots of bees and good resources. And so you take some portion of that. You can make splits that we call our lighter splits or heavier splits, which that just means how many resources are you taking out of the parent colony to put into the new colony. And you can do as little as 1 or 2 frames of brood into a nuke box to create a new colony, or you can go heavy splits and do 4 frames or 5 frames and do a whole single in a split. Okay, again, depends on your objectives in the splitting. Now, in my son's operation, if he's wanting to sell nukes, then he's going to do pretty light splits and give them time to grow up. But then you have to put a lot more queens and resources into it. So you see there's trade-offs in how you do it. But again, the mechanics are essentially the same, and just depends on how much resources you want to add to it. All right, next slide. So what do you get when you finish splitting? Well, you have more colonies. That's number one. So back to the beginning principle, you have a healthy hive coming out of winter. You're going to have a lot of bees from that hive, and you need to do something with those bees. Okay, splitting is one option, and you have more colonies. So if you have dead outs, you can replace them, or if you have friends that need bees, you can help them out. Things like that. It reduces the swarm pressure because it does the thing that the swarm was going to do in the first place. Okay. And the happy side effect is that it's a brood break. So there's kind of natural Varroa management that's going on here. And the cost is more effort and time from you and equipment and queen resources, things like that. So there's a cost to it, but again, you end up with more colonies. All right, next. Okay, so as a side note here, I'm not going to go deeply into spring varroa management, and back to the splitting as a method of varroa management. And I hesitate to use treatment specifically, but it's varroa management. Treatment is a way of managing Varroa, right? And there's a lot of other pieces to Varroa management that we can do and that we do as beekeepers. And splitting is one of those. And that naturally knocks down that reproduction cycle of the Varroa mites. Okay, that's really what you're after. Short of just killing the Varroa with a Varroa side of some sort, is interrupting that Varroa reproduction cycle. Okay. And the brood break does that naturally. And again, I sound like I'm giving an advertisement for Andy Oliver, but I am for his scientific beekeeping website. He's got a really nice population curve that you've seen on slides and things of how the Varroa population grows and in relation to the honeybee population and why it's such a big deal at the end of the summer. So if you can knock that down, at some point earlier in the season, you're going to get a win later in the season. I think I saw a question about Varoxan as the new one of the Varroa control product. And it's one of those that its goal is to kind of hit things here early in the season to knock that down. So again, that's this time of year and controlling Varroa or monitoring Varroa or seeing what is going on with Varroa right now is important to that later Varroa in the season. So there are a lot of different strategies. If you do have really strong, healthy colonies coming out of winter and they're creating a lot of brood, again, that's the place where Varroa will grow. One of the first places you'll generally see that, I think I've got a picture here in a moment, when you're doing those early inspections and you're cracking those boxes apart, they almost always put drone brood right between your supers, right? And so you'll end up with all this exposed larva. And you'll see on the beginning beekeeping pages, people go, well, what are these white things in my inspection? And it's just the larva, but it's a great place to look for Varroa, right? You can quite often that's drone brood. The Varroa, if they're in there, they're going to be in that brood. And so again, you're going to want to look and observe and see what the Varroa loads are like. If you're doing a lot of heavy splitting and things like that, you might not even need much Varroa control this time of year if you're doing a lot of brood breaks. But if you got keeping strong, big populations, then again, there's a lot of different options you can use for Varroa treatment. And again, use HiveTracks. We've got a record for doing mite assessments and recording those things that you do. Next slide. So here is just from a couple of weeks ago, I got some really good images of a Varroa on a drone larva here that was between the boxes. And in this particular case, this was a hive at a place that's pretty far away from me. I wasn't going to be able to come back very quickly. I wasn't planning on splitting, so I went ahead and treated with formic that hive. You can see on the other image there's the formic pads there. And so this was a case, kind of a rare case. I usually don't treat much this time of year because of the way we keep bees. But in this case, I went ahead and threw those on there. As an aside, those drone larvae, they're really tasty if you haven't tried them. Minus the Varroa. Next slide. I just lost half the audience there. All right, so yeah, that's kind of the core things I wanted to cover in terms of spring management. We can go back and pick up questions on that, but for the next few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about where we are with HiveTracks itself, what we have coming up. Some of these we've talked about before, but now they're hardening out and they're getting mature. We're ready for you to use them in your beekeeping. One of those, the first one is this honey story that we've pitched and talked about before. And this is a way that you can differentiate your honey from others, or you can tell your friends and family how much beekeeping means to you, which they get tired of hearing you probably talking about your bees, but here you can give them a way to go look at it on their own time with honey that you give away or sell. So when you harvest honey, and this is with the HiveTracks Pro, when you harvest your honey, we'll create what's called a honey story for you, and you can populate it with content, images, text, things like that describes your beekeeping operation. You can give descriptions of the honey that you make in your area, like the tasting profile, your beekeeping practices, anything you want to say about your honey that you produce. We also pull in data from your HiveTracks app into that honey story. And it's just a really cool way to, just to promote your honey and to communicate with your the people who you're giving your honey to. So that's one cool thing that I really encourage you to use and to try this season. And it's important that you have the good records that go with that, so that the honey story will be complete. The second thing there is where I already talked about the document flora record. We've also got a document pollinator record. So in addition to taking pictures of the flowers and things that are blooming in your area, you can also take pictures of the pollinators that are on these flowers. And again, you're documenting the biodiversity in your either in your apiary or even just in your yard. If you have a garden, if you have a pollinator garden, and you want to document, this is how good my pollinator garden is. These are all the cool pollinators that are coming in there. We give you a way to do that. It's also a way that, beekeeping, I say beekeeping adjacent folks who they might not be beekeepers themselves, but they're very interested in bee health and pollinators in general. And this is a good way to to build bridges with those folks who might be a little leery of honeybees and their impact on native pollinators. This is a big tent, and we all need to be looking out for each other. And so this gives a way for folks to document, how are the pollinators doing in my flower garden. And so encourage you to try that out. Again, that's your homework assignment, is to use the document flora. And then the last bullet here, and this is really a very big deal for us, and I think it will be for you as well, is this concept of groups in the HiveTracks Pro, where you can create groups of beekeepers that share data among themselves. So if you imagine any kind of scenario, there's multiple use cases, if you will, of where this can work. It can work within a club if you want to kind of share within the club what's happening. It's what you do at your club meetings every month anyway. You come in and say, hey, what's happening with your bees? What's happening with your bees? And everybody has this conversation. Through the HiveTracks app, you can kind of elevate that conversation and have everybody talking together about what's going on with their bees. It also works for if your beekeeping club has a club apiary, you can share the information about what's happening with the club apiary out to the whole beekeeping club. You can push, so to speak, the information about that club apiary out to everybody's app. So when they open up their mobile app, they see the club apiary on there and they can see what's going on. And again, it's a great way for disseminating information about what's going on with your club. Also works for mentor mentees, or if you just have beekeeping buddies that you kind of keep bees with and you talk with. I think most of us have within our circles, we have a group that we talk to. And so it's a good way to do that. And then future looking, if you have somebody that is a famous person or whatever, and you want to follow their hives, kind of like Instagram, you could, that would work as well. So you could have sort of an example hive or a prototype hive or a model hive that people could follow. And if you're a beginner, that would be a great way to kind of see what's going on, what should I be doing, that sort of thing. So again, that piece is getting ready to be released very soon. It's in the app right now, but we have a big push new release coming out for that very soon. All right. Good. I think I left sufficient time for Q&A. So these are some questions that, as Danny said, she curated from a list that you submitted early on. If you have other questions that you'd like to submit, I can look at those as well. I see you've been active over there in the chat. I wasn't able to look very closely, but good job talking to each other over there. I'll just go through these. If you have another question, again, put it over there in the chat. Do I need to buy a queen if I do a split now? as the answer to all beekeeping questions is it depends. Yes, you can. Oh, and there was one story I wanted to share. So last week, and it's related to this. Last week, a friend of mine here locally, Jeff Brooks, has a pretty big sideliner operation, and he got a bunch of queens in, and he had some left over, and offered them to me. I was my beekeeping operation, I'm going to be ramping it up. We're going to get some queens and packages and all manner of ways of ramping up our bees again in a couple of weeks. So this was a little bit early for me. Um, and so I needed to find bees to go with these queens, right? And so I had another buddy who lived further across the state of North Carolina. North Carolina is pretty unique, and from my corner down to the coast is a pretty long distance in terms of phenology and spring. And so I traveled a good bit across the state um, to split bees. And so I did exactly what I've been talking about here. I split a bunch of hives there, and in this case, in answer to the question, yes, I bought a queen, right, to go in these hives, and it accelerates the how fast that hive is going to build up. And the other options, as the graphic showed, it's going to depend on the your time scale is going to be lengthened if you do a cell or a walkaway split. All right. Um, hive beetles. I'm I'm thankful that in our area we do not have small hive beetle issues very much in the mountains of North Carolina. They are here, but they don't become an issue. So I don't have a lot of experience with it, and there's all sorts of mechanisms and tools out there, including the plastic traps. And if your bees are propolizing it or covering it up, then yeah, that's just bees being bees and exhibiting their normal behavior. Maybe try different techniques, a different technique, the Swiffer sheets or something that trap them. But again, I don't deal with small hive beetles a lot, so not a lot of experience to go on there. How do you manage old dark frames? I don't know if you noticed in one of the images earlier, but on top of some of the frames, I had a year that was written in Sharpie. And so I do that when I put a new frame into a deep. I try to do this regularly. And so I write on top the year that it went in. Now, there's best practices that suggest there is a time window, 3 to 5 years of cycling out old frames. For me, it's less of a time element and more of a what does it look like, but the time element also plays into that. You could have a deep frame that lived on the edge of a super its whole life, and it looks like a honey frame, right? It doesn't have any dark brood or things like that in it. So again, use your best judgment. You do want to cycle those out is the best practice from a keeping it clean in your hive. Okay, last question here on this page is hive didn't make it. Okay, so a good question is what do you do with dead out equipment, right? Um, One thing is when I was part of Bee Informed Partnership, some of the best management practices we talked about back then for dead outs was get new bees in there as quickly as possible, just to keep that equipment clean, keep the bees, they'll work it and clean it up and that sort of thing. Um, if you live in a cold climate, the dead out was outside in the cold and it froze. You want to freeze. There's recommendations to freeze equipment to make sure that you kill wax moth and things like that. But if it's sitting outside in the cold, that's going to happen naturally, right? But there's good resources. If you got drawn comb in there, definitely you want to reuse that. It's also a good time to cull the dark combs when you have a dead out. It's a nice, easy time to get rid of those as well. All right. That's it on this stage. How much more we got, Danny?
There's a couple more questions coming through, so maybe if we have time, one or two of these that have just dropped in the chat. Maybe we have one from Kyle. When should you stop treating for mites in the spring so it does not contaminate your honey?
Oh yeah, that's a in the spring, treating for Varroa is a challenge. Um, for a few different reasons. One is that you mentioned, many of the Varroa treatments you can't treat when, or you shouldn't treat when you have honey supers on, or you need some time period after the treatment comes off before you make honey. So you have some kind of constraints on the Varroa treatments in the spring. And so that's one reason I really like brood breaks and things like that. I mean, you just have to follow the label, to make sure that your treatments are in line with when your normal honey flow is. So again, that's another question that if you're an experienced beekeeper, you tend to know when your honey flows are, and they tend to happen within, at least a couple of weeks of normal. And so pay attention to, if you don't know what those are for your area, talk to beekeepers in your area to find out kind of when you can expect the honey flows to happen, and then you can gauge your treatments around that. And maybe you have to go to something that's okay with honey supers on, like a formic, um, is okay for that. All right, what else?
Maybe from Jim, he said, speaking of dark frames, how do you manage changing them out when there's brood on them?
Good question. You don't want to cycle them out while you've got good brood in them. And so you can either move them to a place where the queen's not going to lay in them, like you could put them above a queen excluder or something like that, let the brood hatch out and then pull them out, or move it to the outside of an active brood box. And then when it hatches out again, and the queen doesn't lay back in it, pull it out. But I would not sacrifice good brood to call that frame. But it is a tricky situation because if it's actively being used for brood, then how do you cycle it out? That's why when you have a dead out, that's a good time for doing that. Let's see. Oh, I had one other story I forgot to tell on the swarm piece. Swarm trapping, swarm catching is like a really in thing now, or removing hives from structure. I mean, colonies from structures and things like that. Um, One of my very first YouTube videos, actually the first YouTube video that I ever posted, was me catching a swarm in my front yard. I think it was in 2008. So YouTube's been around since at least 2008. Uh, I don't know how early it was before that, but um, yeah, I had YouTube videos before it was cool.
Early adopter. And actually, on that next month, we'll be having an interesting webinar with a guest speaker all
Oh
about
yeah.
swarming. So keep a lookout for that. We'll be having webinars every month, the last Tuesday of every month for the rest of the year.
Anything else?
Maybe if we have time for one more, from Kunal, maybe this one here. 2 to 3 years ago, a new queen bee emerged in the hive, and at the time, a drone bee was nearby. However, the queen did not survive for long. After several days, another queen bee emerged in the same hive, but by then, no drone bees were alive. Now, for many days, the queen has remained in the hive without laying eggs, and the number of remaining honeybees is decreasing. What would you advise to do in this situation, James?
Well, that the queen in the hive doesn't mate with drones in that hive, so that's not critical. But the fact that the drones might be reducing, again, if that's this time of year, that's unusual. That would be more of a late summer, spring thing. But if your queen is not laying, then requeening then would be the right thing to do in that situation.
Okay, I think. Did you want to take another or sure?
Sure. I see there's a debate on Swiffer sheets, which is fine. What was the, I
Did
did
you want to
see,
weigh in on that, James, or?
not really.
Okay. Purav, I know you've got a question. Maybe you could pop it in the chat for us. Can write it down.
No, I do see one about do the bees clean the wax moth webbing? That's a tough one. If the wax moth had or in have gotten in the wax and like totally messed it up, then just clean that out and put new foundation in. They can clean out a little bit, but if it's too messed up, I would trash it. Um, they are pretty resilient at cleaning. They'll clean up stuff that you couldn't imagine that they can clean up, but you want to kind of help them out best you can in that regard. I mean, I have had like an old dead out that a swarm takes up in, and you would think, how in the world are they, managing in that? But they're pretty resilient in cleaning up stuff. And I was just gonna say, yeah, thanks everybody. Appreciate your attendance and attention, and always happy to be with you. And reach out anytime. We're happy that you're here in this journey with us. Yeah.